Story 1. I don't know any other way to start this, but I have to be honest. My therapist asked me to do this as a task. Getting a good therapist is hard and expensive these days, so I'm going to make sure I get the most out of it and do this assignment. About 2 weeks before Halloween, something strange happened. But first, let me give you some background. I live in a very remote town, deep in the woods. It's not just a small town off the highway. It's a few miles into the forest. I got my house after my grandfather passed away. When I asked for it, my family was happy because they didn't want to try selling a house that looked like it belonged in a horror movie. The house is actually pretty nice, and it would have sold for a good price if someone had wanted to buy it, so we agreed that I would pay some rent to my dad and aunt for a few years before I officially owned it. I also got 2 roommates, so my rent was almost nothing. I work at the post office, and there's a lake within view of my house. Anyway, it was about 2 weeks before Halloween last year. I was working late at the post office that night. The day was mostly normal. I worked in the back sorting packages. There were the usual ones, some that rattled when you moved them, small ones that were heavier than they looked, and ones with glass in them that needed to be handled carefully. Just a regular day. But near the end of my shift, a package arrived that smelled really bad. I don't mean it had a normal house smell or something like that. It stank like something was rotting. When we get packages like that, unfortunately, we have to check them, and by we, I mean always me. I put on some gloves and a face mask and opened the package. Those moments when the box cutter is sliding across the tape are very tense. We all hear horror stories about finding dead animals, feces, or even dangerous things in packages. It could have been anything. I kept going and opened the box. At first, I thought it was a pile of feces, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a rotten chocolate cake. I picked up a card next to it. "To Mike, I know this is your favorite, so I thought I'd send you one. Your grandfather." The note became hard to read, with random thoughts and requests for Mike to call, and it ended with, "Grandma loves you." I sighed. It was just a poor old woman who didn't know she couldn't send a cake across the country. But still, I had to get rid of it properly, do the paperwork, and mail the card. It took about an extra hour before I could leave and go home. I said goodbye to my favorite co-workers and left. The drive home in my cold car was nice. I drove on the highway until my turn-off came. Then, I took 20 different turns on the back roads until I got home. When I walked in, my first roommate, Nasco, and his girlfriend were there as usual. They were eating brownies they had baked while watching some anime. I waited for a moment, hoping they would offer me a brownie, but they ignored me. I went upstairs to my room, took off my clothes, and sat in my chair. I turned on my PC and played some games with my online friends for a couple of hours while I ate a bag of chips that was next to my desk. They were a little annoyed that I had to get on later, so we had to stay up longer to play for our usual 2 hours, but we had fun. It was a good day. I worked out in the morning, went to work, and socialized. That was all I really wanted from the day. I was taking off my clothes to go to bed when a light lit up my room from my window. It was clearly a car. The light moved quickly across my ceiling and then disappeared, but it was at an angle that it couldn't have been someone pulling into our yard. That window was facing the lake. The lake next to our house isn't well known, and honestly, it's more like a big pond. It's a fishing spot or swimming hole for the few people who know about it and can bother to come out this far into the woods to see it. So, it wasn't totally unreasonable for someone to be down there, but this was at 11 p.m. on a cold fall night. I climbed onto my bed to look out the window. I saw 2 lights that looked like they were coming from a van. I could see some guys down there, and it looked like they were working on something. But I could barely see all of this. Our house is mostly hidden by the trees. Come to think of it, those guys probably didn't even know our house was there. We were up a hill behind a bunch of trees. The moon was out, but you might still not notice the house. I had a feeling that told me to just go to bed and ignore whatever was happening down there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I thought it would be good to get some fresh air and take out the trash anyway. I grabbed my binoculars, put on some sweatpants and a coat and walked downstairs. The lights under my roommate's doors were off and there was no one in the kitchen. I was the only one up, and that made me even more excited. It felt like an adventure, and for a bored post office worker that was just perfect. Looking back, I'm actually glad I was the only one up. No one else went out with me or anything. I guess it would have been nice to have someone else take on this burden, but I can't really wish any of this to happen to someone else. When you walk into the woods, normally there's so much happening. So many little things make noise and move around. But that night, everything was silent and still. The only way I can describe it is that when a lot is happening around you, your attention is taken away and you don't notice the small things. That night, the lack of action made me more aware of everything. It was crisp and cold outside. There was no wind. I couldn't hear any animals or insects. And the moon was full and bright. The whole scene made me stop on the doorstep for a second, but I continued down the old wooden stairs and over to my trash can. As I was lowering the trash bag into the can, I heard voices from across the lake. I slowly walked over to the edge of the trees and raised my binoculars to my eyes. I focused them and saw that it was indeed a van, and there were 3 men. I recognized them immediately. I went to high school with them, but now they looked terrible. They were clearly addicts. Their eyes were sunken, their skin was pale and covered in marks, and their clothes were dirty and loose. But what worried me was the large black trash bag on the ground in front of them. It was moving. I reached into my pocket to get my phone and call the police, but my pockets were empty. I had forgotten my phone. I was about to go back to get it when I saw one of the guys, a man named Walton or Walt, take out a revolver. At that moment, it felt like I was watching something that had already happened, but still, when he aimed at the bag and the sound of the gunshot echoed everywhere, I could hardly stand it. I moved further behind the tree I was hiding behind so they wouldn't see me. I had to remind myself to breathe. When I calmed down enough to stop shaking so much, I looked through the binoculars again. The bag was no longer moving, and Walt and the other 2 guys, Martin and John, were just staring at it. Finally, Walt snapped out of it and shook the other guys back to reality. They all picked up the bag, carried it to the bank, and threw it into the water. I guess there was something heavy in the bag because it sank immediately. Then they quickly went back to their van and drove away. After I lowered the binoculars, I realized I was still shaking. I've watched many horror movies and played violent video games, so I thought I would be used to seeing stuff like this, but I was still scared. I managed to turn around and walk back to the house. Halfway across the yard, I noticed the sounds of the night slowly coming back, and my mind started working again. I suddenly became afraid that the van might come up into my yard while I was out in the open. I ran up the creaky stairs, fumbled with the door, and finally slammed it shut and locked it. I looked out the window, still shaking, for about 15 minutes. Nothing happened. I've thought about it a lot, and I really believe they didn't know my house was there. They thought they had found a perfect place to dump a body without anyone finding it. When I got back to my room, I was a little surprised to see that I was still the only one awake. But then I realized that even with a gunshot on a quiet night, it was about 300 yards away, down a hill, while my roommates were asleep with the windows closed. They probably didn't hear anything. When I closed the door, I immediately picked up my phone. I was about to call 911 when I had a sudden thought. I couldn't just make an anonymous tip. If I called it in, they would ask me for a statement. They could match the tire tracks to Walt's van, but they would almost certainly need me to testify in court. I could even become a suspect. I lowered the phone and sat on the edge of my bed. I felt terrible, but after about 30 minutes, I decided to let it go. I knew it would have been better for the family, but I didn't want to get involved, and she was already dead. Things were going well for me at that time. It was a selfish decision, but I just made sure my door was locked, promised myself I'd buy a gun that week, and went to bed. I tried to sleep, but it's not easy after something like that. During the night, something strange happened. The lights started glowing. They didn't come on fully. They just glowed halfway and then went dark again. My ceiling lights did this, then my closet light, and finally even my computer screen. But everything was off, none of the switches had been touched, and my computer never actually turned on. This went on for about an hour before, finally, every light source in my room started to glow slightly. When it was each bulb individually, they were brighter, but when all of them glowed together, you could barely tell if they were on or off. Then everything flickered and stopped. I didn't know what to make of it. I had just watched someone be murdered, and now my lights were acting weird. I stayed frozen in bed for another hour before I finally fell asleep out of exhaustion. I don't usually have dreams, but that night I had a strange dream. It wasn't scary. It was just a bright white background with a dark figure that looked a bit like a person. I must have only had the dream at the end of my sleep, because my alarm woke me up just a few moments after the figure appeared. That's all that really happened, and though it was memorable, I didn't think much of it. I had other things on my mind, and I was glad I didn't have a nightmare about what had happened the night before. After turning off my alarm, I sat in bed for a while. I looked at my phone and thought hard about my decision. Finally, I decided that the police could probably trace anonymous calls, and if I managed to leave an anonymous tip like a letter, they'd just look up the hill and see my house. I'd be questioned anyway. I'd end up as a suspect, and so would my roommates. They would probably need my testimony to confirm that Martin and John were there with Walt. There was no way to report this without getting involved, and I still didn't want that. Just like ignoring a homeless person or charity requests, I decided to move on. I didn't work out that morning. I just wasn't in the mood, but my day was otherwise the same. I got up, made some breakfast, and watched TV before work. I wanted to go out and look at the lake, just to see the same spot from the night before, but I forced myself not to. Finally, I left the house and went to my car, all while trying not to look in the lake's direction. Work was the same as usual. Someone asked me why I was so quiet, but I brushed them off and kept working. No rotten packages came, just the usual ones. The whole shift felt like a blur. Honestly, it's been so long, and it wasn't important in the context of everything else. I guess something wild could have happened that day, and I just don't remember it. I drove home and picked up some fast food on the way. I made all the usual turns and parked my car on the lawn. But when I got out and started walking towards the door, I noticed the leaves in the corner of the yard rustling. It was against the wind, and I couldn't see any animal that might have caused it. Then the leaves kept rustling and moving closer, like someone was running across the yard. It all happened so fast. Whatever was moving, the leaves hit me, but I couldn't feel it physically. I suddenly felt 10 degrees colder, went deaf for a moment, and then everything went back to normal, except for a slight ringing in my ears. Seeing the murder and the lights flashing was very alarming, but I didn't feel like I was in danger. The murder didn't involve me, and the lights could have been an electrical issue. But after the leaves in the yard, I was seriously scared that something was happening. Still, there wasn't much more I could do. I looked around to make sure it wouldn't happen again and went inside. My roommate and his girlfriend were on the couch, and my other roommate, Pac, was making ramen in the kitchen. I just yelled out my usual hello, hey-yo. I called out to everyone and ran up the stairs to my room. As soon as I entered, I noticed it was colder in my room. It wasn't as cold as it felt outside earlier, but still, it was noticeably colder than it should have been. I didn't have an extra fan or anything that would make it colder. I didn't think much about it. Strange things were happening, and I didn't want to be alone. Even though it looked odd to my roommates that I had just rushed past them and ran upstairs, I came back down and ate my fast food in the dining room. I remember they could tell something was wrong, but I just ignored their questions and watched whatever anime they had on from the table while I ate. While I was eating, one of the lights that was off started glowing, like they had the night before. I quickly looked at everyone else in the room. They didn't say anything. I even asked if they could see it. They just gave me a concerned look and told me no. I never brought it up with them after everything happened, and since Pac doesn't live here anymore, I can't ask him. I guess they never saw anything I saw. Knowing I was the only one seeing these things freaked me out more, but I was still glad I wasn't alone. Eventually, they all left me alone. Pac finished making his ramen and went up to his room. Nasco's girlfriend went to the bedroom. I think she was annoyed at me for interrupting their TV time, even though it was my house, so Nasco had to follow her. I don't remember exactly what he said while leaving, but it was close to this. "All right, well, I think we're going to stay in the bedroom for the rest of the night. That cool?" "Oh, yeah, man, that's all good." He picked up on my nervous tone. "I can, leave this TV on if you want." "Yeah, that sounds good, man. Thanks." He nodded, still looking a bit concerned, and left me there, alone. It happened pretty soon after Nasco left. I was finishing my fries when the lights started again, this time all of them. First, the ones that were off started glowing, but quickly they became as bright as the lights that were already on, and then they all started glowing even brighter. I thought they would burst, but they just kept getting brighter. The TV started flickering, and I realized I was slowly going deaf again, like outside. The TV was flickering back and forth between the anime it was on originally and an image. Finally, it stopped on the image. It was me. It was me sitting at the table at that exact moment, looking at the TV as if someone was taking a video from the middle of the living room. The lights became almost blinding, and I couldn't hear anything. I got up to try to run outside, but it was so bright I couldn't see where I was going, and I tripped over one of the chairs. The lights became blinding, and I covered my eyes, waiting for it to end. Slowly I started to hear again, and the lights began to dim. I didn't hear the same sounds as before, though. It sounded like strong wind, and when I could open my eyes again, I realized everything around me had changed. The floors, which were already worn, now looked 1,000 years older. When I looked up from the floor, I saw that everything was falling apart, if it was even there at all. The kitchen was almost empty, except for the stove. But I don't remember much about the rest of the house because the next place I looked was the living room. There, standing in the middle, was a black trash bag. I quickly got up and ran for the door. When I opened it, I stared out in horror. The landscape had changed from deep southern woods at night to a barren, desolate wasteland where nothing grew. It was just hills and mountains of dirt. The moon and the sun were both out, and they were both red. Roaming all over this landscape were skeletons, burning skeletons that walked upright, and as soon as I opened the door, they all turned towards me. The air was filled with their otherworldly screams as they ran towards my door. I shut it quickly and turned back towards the trash bag in my living room. I knew it was the one from the night before. It was shaking and had turned to face me. It was terrifying, but I chose it over whatever was happening outside. "I'm sorry," I cried out. The bag started shaking even more, and finally I heard a strained voice cry out, "Help me!" As soon as the plea ended, everything suddenly went back to normal. I was deaf for a moment, but then the sound of the TV came back. The house was no longer falling apart, and when I looked out the living room window, I saw the trees in the moonlight. I didn't move for a while, but finally I turned around and cracked the door open. No wasteland, just woods. I was in shock over everything that had happened. I didn't want to walk into the living room because that's where the bag had been. I didn't want to go upstairs to my room because the lights had flickered there the night before. I didn't want to go outside because it looked fine, but I couldn't be sure of anything. I just went into the kitchen and stood against the stove. My therapist told me these were hallucinations from extreme stress and guilt. I agree with her. It's also impossible that her explanation has to be correct, but it felt so vivid and real when it happened. Anyway, I'm getting tired. For now, goodbye. Story 2. Most people think social work is a calling, something you are born to do. A destiny decided by the goodness of your soul. That always seemed like a load of nonsense to me. But hey, maybe that's true for some of my colleagues. Maybe some of them are like saints, driven only by the desire to help the needy. That's not me, though. The job isn't saintly work either. Saintly work implies that the process is holy and fair, which it isn't. Not at all. Social work puts you in the trenches like a soldier fighting the good fight. Last time I checked, we didn't send the Pope and his bishops, armed with crosses and holy water, to storm the beaches of Normandy. It's a messy, messy job. No place for someone who isn't okay with getting their hands dirty. Helping the desperate puts you in touch with all kinds of heartache, misery, depravity, tragedy, sadism, loneliness. The list could go on, but I don't want to turn this story into a novel. But don't just take my word for it. As a regular on the social worker subreddit, I'll share a quote posted by a fellow worker a few years back that I made a point of saving. Social work is easy. Just like riding a bike, except the bike is on fire and everything is on fire because you're in hell. But I'm getting off track. Back to the point, you may be asking yourself, why does Corvus do this, if not for the good of mankind? Also, what kind of name is Corvus? No idea about the name, but I have reasons for doing what I do. 2 reasons, really. First, I've been doing this job for what seems like forever. Started in the early 1990s, well before Monica Lewinsky was a household name. Been doing it so long that it's practically all I know how to do. Second, it distracts me. Hell isn't fun, but it sure is stimulating. It's hard to think about anything else amidst the chaos. I don't like to think about my past, it's too painful. I'd rather be somewhere else, even if that somewhere is like the DMV in Dante's Inferno. And I'm a bit of a workaholic. When I'm on the job, I barely feel the need to eat or sleep. I get lost in it, and I've grown fond of that feeling, and that is what I would have believed to my last breath if it weren't for Charlie. So I'm sitting at my desk, minding my own business between clients, when I see this young guy walk in the front door of the office a good 100 yards away. A real tall, dark and handsome type, medium-length curly brown hair, messy in a way that looks intentional, black blazer, black turtleneck, brown pants, about 6'2". Honestly, I think he caught my eye because he looked so out of place. Young, attractive, put together, tall. I couldn't imagine what he needed us for. He's scanning the room, looking for someone, and I feel pretty sure it's not me because I don't know this guy. But then our eyes meet. We're staring at each other, and I can tell he's stopped searching. He starts walking straight towards me, and I have no clue what he wants, but in social work you get used to the possibility of violence from strangers. Maybe he's the angry husband of a domestic abuse victim I helped. Maybe he's a father who hit his kid, and I called Child Protective Services on him. The possibilities are, unfortunately, endless. I clutch a screwdriver under the palm of my right hand and brace myself for the worst. As you might guess, I'm pretty used to craziness. It's not exactly hidden in this whole thing, but craziness suits me. It takes up a lot of space in my mind and my nervous system, which is kind of the whole appeal. I've got a lot of repressed traumas, a real treasure trove of bad childhood events that I sometimes feel rumbling in the back of my head. I've done a good job keeping them locked up, mostly. There is one thing that slipped out, though, and if it weren't important to the rest of this, I wouldn't even mention it. When I was really young, I almost drowned. I fell to the bottom of a pool for some reason, and no one was around to help. Who knows where my parents were? A lifeguard pulled me up at the last second, just as the water started filling my lungs. At least I think she was a lifeguard. All I remember afterward is the sun in my eyes and feeling dazed. I don't remember much before or after that, and I don't care to. I can't even go near a pool nowadays or any body of water. Over the years I've gotten a lot of criticism for not getting help, unpacking everything. But as far as I'm concerned, the work is all the therapy and medicine I'll ever need. In fact, I've made a point not to see a professional about it, never been to a therapist, never been to a doctor. People consider me a professional. Trust me, being behind that curtain is eye-opening. Before I had this job, though, I was living on the streets. Theo, a social worker who was a legend at my office, God rest his soul, found me one night and offered to help. Over time, I got back on my feet. Thankfully, back in the 90s, you didn't need a master's degree to pursue social work, and a bachelor's degree was pretty easy to fake before the internet. One short year later, I was working alongside my mentor. Best 15 years of my life. My only regret is not getting closer to him. He was always open and vulnerable with me. The number of times I rejected an invitation for dinner with his wife and family is probably in the triple digits. It just never felt possible, never felt right. So anyway, the stranger gets to my desk, and I am ready for whatever trouble this guy has in mind. Instead of trying to attack me, he stops a few feet away, slams a weathered newspaper on my desk, crosses his arms and waits impatiently like I'm the one holding him up. It takes me a minute to adjust to this new craziness and respond. All the while this guy is glaring at me, then looking at the paper, then back at me, over and over, tapping his right foot as if to say, "I'm waiting, old man." Eventually, I put on my reading glasses to look at the old newspaper. It was a copy of the New York Times from the winter of 1993. I looked back at him, completely confused, and in the sweetest voice I could manage, I asked him, "Can you kindly explain to me what the heck I'm looking at?" He snatched the paper from my hands, flipped through it, and looked angry with me for not understanding. Finally, he found what he was looking for, flipped the paper back to me, and pointed to an article circled in blue ink. The column he circled was in the reader-submitted dating tips section. And for those of you young enough to be asking, yes, people used to actually look to others for dating tips in a major newspaper. God bless the 90s, I almost didn't read the title of the article he circled. I mean, would you have? I don't usually look for chances to get involved in every crazy situation happening on the streets of New York, but maybe I kind of do, veteran social worker and all that. So I looked at the title, and immediately I recognized the article. It became pretty infamous when I started as a social worker, and not because it gave great advice on hairstyles. I still didn't know why this silent stranger was showing it to me, but it did spark my interest a bit. He had circled the first and only big break in the Lady Hemlock ritual killings that terrorized Brooklyn that winter. The article was titled, "An Occultist's Guide to Love and Loss in the 20th Century." For those of you who weren't on the NYPD 30 years ago, let me give you a quick summary. 6 unexplained bodies in a little over 3 months, all killed by a single puncture wound through the back of the neck and out the front. 2 middle-aged men, an elderly couple, a wealthy widowed small business owner, and a rising football star from a local high school. All terrifying, but the kid's death was like gasoline on a growing fire. People wanted answers, but the police had none to give. This killer was busy too. A new body was found about every 2 weeks, like clockwork, but the police didn't know where to start. The victims seemed random, no unifying age, gender, job, nothing in common except the way they were killed, at least at first. Eventually, it was discovered during autopsies that each victim had a different shape carved inside their skull, right between the eyes. How did the killer do that? Who knows? If the police had any ideas, they didn't share them with the public. If you're a fan of unsolved mysteries like me, you would eventually learn that experts in the occult couldn't agree on the origin of the strange marks, or more hauntingly, how they were made before death. This was during the height of the Satanic Panic, so before the police commissioner could even say Nordic-looking rune during a press conference, people were ready for a witch hunt. They needed something to hold on to, some piece of evidence to assure them that the authorities were closing in on this killer. Thankfully, some real Sherlock Holmes type in the NYPD noticed something in the paper one day that gave everyone something to think about. About a week before each body was found, a contributor named Lady Hemlock had been published in the Dating Tips section of the New York Times. The advice itself was pretty harmless. Bizarre, cryptic, and borderline nonsensical, sure. but it wasn't a confession to the crimes or anything. Nothing like, "Hi, I'm Jeffrey Dahmer, and here are some tips on how to break the ice on the first date by discussing the benefits of low-income housing." With each article, however, a certain shape would be printed alongside it, shapes that 1 week later would be carved inside someone's skull while they were still alive. So the search was on for Lady Hemlock. The police initially thought she worked at the New York Times because it was suspicious that the killer could reliably get their articles published ahead of time while staying on a tight 2-week schedule. No person of interest was ever identified at the Times, though, and there was only one more victim, but it was the most confusing and gruesome. All the internal organs of some poor person were found in a trash can by a local park, and I mean all of them: lungs, colon, liver, spleen, every gross organ except the brain. None of it belonged to the previous victims or any other bodies that ended up in the morgue in the following decades. The murder was linked to Lady Hemlock because of a shape carved on the outside of the heart, and while that is all very interesting, I still had no idea why this man had kept the article for 30 years to then shove it under my nose. So I asked him again, "What, dear God, are you trying to tell me?" Then he started making wild gestures that earned him his nickname. He pointed at the paper, then at himself, then at me, then at the paper, then back at himself, then back at the paper. We came to know him around the office as Charlie, a reference to Charlie Chaplin because he was mute and used vigorous pantomiming. At one point he seemed to have a moment of realization and began to take off his blazer and turtleneck. That's when I decided I had seen enough. "Marco, get this guy out of here," I called to our favorite security guard. We liked him for his work ethic, but we loved him for the beatboxing he did while on shift. Kicking and screaming, Charlie was dragged out of our office, Marco throwing the newspaper out after him. In the process, a sticky note fell out of the folds onto the entrance mat. Marco looked at it, read it, and then walked back and handed it to me. "What you doing that for, man?" I asked, wondering why everyone had chosen me as their target for weirdness today. "I think it's for you, bud," Marco replied, still huffing and puffing from the commotion. The note in my hand said, "Thanks, Corvus. Appreciate the help." Charlie and his one-man show became a regular thing around the office the following month. At first it was mostly just silly, because Charlie never seemed intent on hurting anyone. He just had this strange need to show me dating advice from a serial killer, who, as far as I know, is still free today. But he was never physically aggressive or violent. I offered to help him if he could talk to me or provide some documentation about where he was from, what he was doing here, and what he needed help with, but it always came back to that darn article. Eventually, Charlie had to find new and creative ways to get the paper to me because security started recognizing him on sight. He came to the office early, then he mailed a copy to me, then he waited for me to leave and followed me to my car with it. Why didn't I call the cops? Well, as I said, I'm pretty used to craziness. As long as it never turned violent, I would wait for Charlie to tire himself out and start bothering someone else. Over time, though, it went from funny to sad. Every time he came in, he wore the same clothes. Then I noticed he wasn't shaving or showering. Clearly he was homeless. I wanted to help him, but he seemed unwilling to accept the kind of help I could offer. One night I was working late in the office, typing up a case report, when Mr. Chaplin somehow appeared out of nowhere in front of me. Scared me half to death. Weakly, he handed me that article again. I looked up at this odd, frightened-looking man and wondered if this was how Theo felt seeing me for the first time. Whether it was exhaustion, pity, or me channeling my mentor, I gave in. "Sit down and keep your shirt on," I grumbled. He did as he was told, and I once again began to look at that article, An Occultist's Guide to Love and Loss in the 20th Century. Charlie, for the 1,000th time, stared at me and said nothing. I guessed that he wanted me to read the whole thing while he watched, and there was no way I could have anticipated why at the time. I sighed, turned on a lamp, and began to read the column. Judging by the date, I believe this was the first one printed, the column that came out before the first victim was found. Dear readers, please spare me a few moments. The world has become lost, blinded by technology and the material world. In doing so, we are rejecting the spiritual, the unseen energy that flows through those favored by the six-eyed crow, our universal mother. What do we gain from rejecting this energy? A group of suitable partners to continue the bloodline, prosperity in our rightful place in the celestial order, power and control over those who would suppress the spiritual ley line. No, I don't think so. But despite defeat, I remain firm and steadfast. I will continue to preserve the sanctity of the spiritual energy by practicing the old ways. My grandmother always told me, do not take less than what is owed to you. Compromise is the corruption that taints and destroys every choice. She lived by these words, as my grandfather was an amalgam created from the essence of many. Our coven, and even my mother, rejected the old ways and questioned the divinity given to us by the universal mother. This rejection did not deter my grandmother. It strengthened her beliefs. Her message only grew louder, making her a symbol of devotion and eventually a martyr. I wanted to live by her words, and in this, I have succeeded. I have created many amalgams over the years, but I have yet to achieve the perfection needed to create my offspring. Because of their imperfection, I have cast them out to wander the mortal world alone, forced to live with divinity unfulfilled. Lately, however, I am tormented by my own imperfections. Although I continue to live by my grandmother's words, I lack the courage to spread the message openly, which I believe is necessary to revive our coven. The voice of the spiritual energy grows quiet among the noise of the world and my current amalgam. Allow me to correct this mistake. Hear these words. Every soul carries a part of the spiritual energy, however small, and it can be harnessed to draw closer to the universal mother. Follow me, my example, my instructions, and my image into the next dawn, and witness as I create a new amalgam, casting aside the defective and imperfect predecessor. A new creation born of 6 qualities: devotion to adhere, courage to fight, desire to take, wisdom to live, faith to believe, and the purity to remain silent. If you follow these words and learn from my example, your ascension is sure to follow. When I finished, I noticed Charlie writing something down on a small piece of paper. I reached over to take it, thinking it was a message explaining why he had been so insistent on me reading this strange nonsense. He raised a finger to my hand, however, and pushed it back. He then stood up slowly, inhaling and exhaling, closing his eyes as if to center himself. In one smooth motion, he revealed a pocket knife he had hidden in the breast pocket of his blazer and stabbed it into his own chest. He then dragged the knife up the length of his chest, smoke and steam rising from the wound that was otherwise clean and bloodless. In stunned horror, I watched him put one hand on either side of the new slit on his chest, pulling it open to reveal an empty cavity. He watched me intently while he did this. No pain or discomfort on his face, just sadness and longing. Before I could react, he lifted the knife into the air and then plunged it into my chest. I let out a blood-curdling scream, not out of physical pain, but out of sheer existential terror and shock. I couldn't find the will to move as Charlie put his hands into the wound and pulled outward as hard as he could. Nothing. No blood. No pain. Just steam, useless mist rising up and disappearing. I'm just as empty as the nightmare standing before me, I thought. My scream eventually stopped, and I became catatonic as Charlie reached into his pocket and handed me the piece of paper to read. We are kin. Just like a house of cards, you pull one card loose and the whole thing comes toppling down. Usually that card isn't as extreme as a knife through your chest, revealing a very noticeable lack of vital organs, but I digress. Charlie and I spent the entire night in my office after I recovered from the shock. Through a series of writings, he explained that a bright, fuzzy light handed him the old newspaper and the note. at which point he found himself outside my office. The sticky note was written in a different handwriting than Charlie's, so we believe it was penned by Lady Hemlock. Thanks, Corvus. Appreciate the help. He had no memories before all that. So he stood outside the office, read the article a few times, and then wondered what to do next. It took him a while to figure out he was supposed to go inside, knowing he should look for something but not knowing what. When our eyes met suddenly, he knew what to do. He was struck by lightning, according to him. Kin recognizing kin. In the end, he theorized that I was an amalgam like him. The timeline adds up. I met Theo in 91, got the job in 92, and the killing started in 93, meaning I would have already been abandoned by the time Charlie was made. Why Lady Hemlock put us together is an entirely separate issue, as it contradicts what she said in that article. Maybe she changed her mind about isolating her so-called imperfect creations. Regardless, the revelation certainly gave my obsession with distraction some new dimensions. It's hard to unpack your childhood memories if you don't have any. It's probably not a great idea to attend a dinner at your mentor's house and not be able to eat, assuming the food just kind of drops into some unholy internal nothingness. I may or may not have actually been drinking alcohol when Theo found me on the street. If I was, I imagine it didn't do much other than pickle the inside of my empty abdomen. The weight of it all sometimes overwhelms me to the point of tears. I'm man enough to admit it. Charlie tells me to take it one day at a time, more accurately writes it down and hands it to me. He still can't talk. He doesn't remember what his name was before, so he still goes by Charlie. We worry that his appearance signals a new series of Lady Hemlock killings as she tries to create a more perfect amalgam, but we'll deal with that when the time comes. We've thought about going to the police, but we're not sure how they would react to the whole lack of organs thing. Both of our chest wounds were healed by the time we left the office in the morning, so we're assuming they probably couldn't kill us even if they wanted to. It's been nice, honestly. Having Charlie, I mean. Whatever we are, we can at least be it together. That counts for something. He will have to get his master's degree if he wants to pursue social work, though. It's 2024, after all. Not everyone can be so lucky as to be created under some godless death ritual in the 90s. Story 3. Every time someone vanished from a Hote National Park, 3 things were always the same. First, it was always raining heavily. Second, witnesses heard a strange clicking noise. Third, no clues or hints were ever found about what happened to the missing people. My friend Eric decided to tell us this spooky story on our first night in the park as we sat around the campfire. Eric started with a spooky tone. Other hikers didn't just hear clicking, he said, the shadows from the fire dancing on his face. That was the last thing they heard. The worst part was the screams, desperate, terrifying screams, followed by loud cracks that echoed through the forest like a whip. Like a whip? Hannah said, laughing. Yeah, Eric replied, looking a bit hurt. What? No, nothing. Yeah, that's really scary, Hannah said, trying to sound serious. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to tell the story? Eric asked, clearly annoyed. No, go ahead, Hannah said, raising her hands in mock innocence. Eric continued with a playful glare at Hannah. Like I was saying, other hikers heard the victims' screams before they vanished. And that's not all. He described how the surviving hikers were confused. Some took days or even weeks to find their way out of the park after the disappearances. These weren't beginner hikers. Many were very experienced and had hiked the trails many times before, but they said the trails weren't there anymore, that they had disappeared like the people. Others disagreed, saying the trails had changed. Some even believed that years had passed since they first entered the forest and that the trails had become overgrown with time. Eric explained that since the last disappearance was decades ago, people had come up with crazy theories about what happened, but the only people who really knew were the descendants of the Watomi tribe. Eric looked around the nearby trees and continued. He said that this area of Arizona used to be part of the Watomi reservation, until about 100 years ago when the United States government took it. According to the natives, US soldiers used any means necessary to take their land, attacking the Watomi while they slept, cutting down entire sections of the forest to move them, and starting controlled fires to suffocate them. After 12 hard-fought years, the Watomi were forced to move to Black Mesa. But the Watomi were not forgiving. They were proud and had a long history of seeking revenge against those who wronged them. Yes, they lost the war, but they captured many US hostages after battles and performed a horrific ritual on them. One by one, the hostages were tied to a stake. Their skin was covered with tar and oil to look like the bark of the nearby aspen trees. One by one, they were chopped apart like branches of a tree. The natives danced around them, singing harsh guttural words and laughing as the hostages bled slowly to the ground, but they didn't kill them right away. The Watomi were not forgiving, and the US military had not only cut down their trees, but also burned them. The blood that had fallen to the stacks of wood below was now used as fuel. As the flames rose slowly up to the stumps of the victims, the Watomi chanted louder, joining their voices with the terrible screams that echoed into the night sky. By now, Hannah had no criticism for Eric's storytelling. She remained completely silent, and for a long moment there was no sound but the crackling of the fire. Even Jazz, Eric and Hannah's tan and white sheepdog, was silent. Finally, my girlfriend Courtney seemed to say what we were all thinking. "Jesus Christ, that's terrifying." "And I'm not even done," Eric said. "Okay, well, get a move on then," said Hannah, only half joking. Once the ritual was over, Eric said, giving Hannah a side-eye, and the US soldiers were now nothing but ash. They were each. But we never heard what happened next. At that moment, Jazz ran away from the fire, barking madly. "Hey!" yelled Eric. He stood up, put his fingers to his mouth and whistled. "Jazz!" "Here, boy!" yelled Hannah. Courtney and I followed them through the dark woods to where Jazz was barking wildly at a tall aspen tree. An image was carved into its trunk, a single eye, large and lidless, staring at us. Hannah knelt down and patted Jazz on the head. "There we go. It's all right. Good boy." She looked up at Eric. "What the hell is that?" "I have no idea," Eric replied, staring at the eye carving. But I could tell he wasn't being entirely truthful. He looked shaken by something. After Jazz finally calmed down, we returned to the campsite. The others wanted to hear the end of Eric's story, but he clearly didn't want to tell it anymore. Courtney and Hannah protested for a while, but I didn't say a word. I thought I knew where the story was heading, and I didn't want to think about it. The next day passed without incident until something happened that Eric said hadn't occurred at Ojote National Park for decades. It began to pour rain. This seemed to have an exciting effect on the other hikers, who all appeared to be moving through the trees in the same direction, laughing, drinking, and singing. "Upper Ojote Falls," Eric said. "It hasn't been active since the late 60s. So we joined the crowd, moving up Pleasant Valley, along Soldiers Trail, and through Crescent Pass. Eventually, we reached an enclosed area that looked like the end of a very large stone hallway. It was packed with people, all looking up at the sheer cliff face at the opposite end. Water was trickling down from the top, and people were taking fake showers underneath and splashing their friends. The rain, which had lessened to a light pattering during our hike up, suddenly started pouring heavily again. The area was bombarded by a torrential downpour. Everyone took shelter under the overhanging cliffs, huddling together and talking excitedly as the flow of the falling water increased. Then, as if someone had lowered a dam wall above, a sudden surge of water came rushing over the cliff, and the waterfall sprang back to life. There was a loud cheer, clapping, cheering, and singing from every direction, and many people went out to dance in the rain. It took a couple of hours for the weather to calm down, and once it did, we decided to find our way back to the campsite we had used the night before. But there was some confusion. "It should be here," Eric said, looking at his map with doubt. "This doesn't make any sense." We were alone in the thick forest again, and as darkness began to settle, the joy of the afternoon had vanished. After carefully walking down the muddy slopes of the valley for hours, it looked like we had lost the trail. "It's like the story from last night," Hannah suggested. "Don't," said Eric. He wasn't in the mood for that. "We'll be fine. We must have stepped off the trail somewhere back there. It's getting dark, though. We won't make it back even if we find the trail," Hannah said. "What do you suggest then? We just camp here?" Eric looked around at the small clearing, not pleased. "Well, what else are we going to do?" Hannah asked. "What do you think?" Eric asked, looking directly at me. Hannah was signaling me with her eyes, trying to get me to agree with her. The rain was getting heavier. "It's as good as any other place we'll find," I responded. So we set up camp. After managing to get the tent stakes into the damp ground, Courtney and I went to our tent to rest. But when I fell asleep, I had the strangest dream I could ever remember. I was lying on the forest floor, but it wasn't wet anymore. It wasn't even made of dirt. Something was moving beneath me, squiggling under my back and legs. I turned and saw, to my horror, that I was lying on a bed of large, coiling snakes. They were writhing wildly, slithering over and under each other. I tried to stand and run, but I couldn't. They wrapped themselves around my torso, trying to drag me under. Then I heard a dog barking, and the snakes suddenly released me to slither toward a small figure in the distance. It was Jazz. The snakes moved quickly, circling all over his body until he disappeared. The frantic barking turned into high-pitched, desperate yelps. The snakes waved their tails at me menacingly, filling the forest with their terrible rattles. I woke up suddenly. "Aaron, Aaron, wake up!" Courtney was sitting up in the tent, looking around nervously. I could tell the rain had stopped, but there was a lot of commotion outside. "What is it?" "I think it's Jazz." There was a panicked yelping noise coming from outside the tent, and then crack. The yelping turned into a high-pitched squeal, then resumed, faster and louder than before. Eric and Hannah were yelling outside. "Where is he?" "I don't know." "Jazz!" "Oh my God, Eric, listen to him. Eric, it's okay, he'll be all right. Jazz! Jazz!" Crack. The yelping became even higher pitched, but softer this time, as if there wasn't much voice left. Courtney and I unzipped the tent door and hurried outside. We saw Hannah and Eric rushing off into the darkness. We followed as quickly as we could. We could hear Jazz up ahead. We were getting closer, nearly there. Crack. The yelping stopped. Courtney and I reached the edge of a small hollow where Eric and Hannah had stopped. They were scanning every inch of their surroundings. A few of the nearby trees had eyes carved into them. "Jazz, Jazz, Jazz, where are you? Jazz!" But there was no other sound, nothing except, starting slow and soft, then building with a series of ever-increasing clicks, was an unnerving, rattling noise. It seemed to come from the air itself, growing to a deafening peak before fading away again, slowly and softly, back to silence. Hannah was visibly shaking. "Oh my God! Eric! Eric, did you hear him? He sounded like he was..." There were tears streaming down her face. "I know." Eric pulled her close and wrapped his arms around her, still looking around. "I know." As Hannah cried against Eric's chest, Courtney grabbed my hand and leaned her head on my shoulder. We waited there in silence, and though I couldn't see her face, I knew we were both crying too. After a long and unsuccessful search of the nearby trees, we tried to return to our tents. But something even stranger happened. Our campsite was missing. "Where is it?" "I don't know." "Are you sure it was here?" "Yeah, that rock was there before." "But that doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense. We were definitely in the same small clearing where we had set up camp, but it was as if someone had taken all our stuff while we were looking for Jazz." "Look, we need to find shelter," Eric said after a few minutes of panic. It's starting to rain again and whatever's out here. But we don't know where the trail is, I reminded him. It doesn't matter. We just need to head uphill. There were cabins on our way down. We just have to retrace our steps. But there were no steps to retrace. The rain had turned all the dirt to mud. The ground remained as flat as ever. We travelled through an endless plain of trees until somehow, by some stroke of luck, we came upon a shelter. I've heard about these, said Courtney. I think they're first come, first serve. I wonder if anyone's in there. Though the shelter was empty, there were a lot of miscellaneous items scattered around. Flashlights, matches, water bottles, and canned food. There were also some sleeping bags on the shelter's flat hardwood floor. Something else interested me more than any of the other items. On a small wooden desk in the corner was a travel log. If you don't know what a travel log is, it's like a guest book at an Airbnb. Instead of comments about home decor and local restaurants, it's a diary where dozens of travelers describe their experiences while hiking in the park. They often include fun drawings, song lyrics, and tips for navigating the area. This was the most interesting travel log I had ever read. As rain pounded against the shelter roof and the others tried to get the fireplace going, I lost myself in its pages. There were many crude, very realistic drawings in the travel log. One showed a bear eating a woman alive. Another showed a man's screaming head sticking out of a roaring campfire. There was also a drawing of a man in pain as leaves, twigs, and branches grew out of his skin. The log also had pages filled with strange, crazy writings and odd symbols. One page had only a tiny scrawl of words in the center that read, "Ahote equals the restless ones." Another page had a creepy poem with the last 4 words underlined. "Twice born in sunlight and once born in bone, the victimless victims grow harder than stone. For those who survived through the battle were slain, and death calls again with the rattle of rain." I wanted to show the others, but I knew it wasn't the right time. Before I put the travel log down, I noticed one last drawing. It showed Native American warriors with spears in their hands running alongside a dog that looked just like Jazz. It had the same body shape and the same tan and white coat. I don't remember crawling into one of the sleeping bags, and I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because when I opened my eyes I was lying on the shelter floor. There was a soft tapping noise echoing in my head. It was getting slower and slower, eventually fading away to complete silence. I immediately pushed myself up onto my side. Lying next to me, also appearing to have just woken up, were Hannah and Eric. Courtney was nowhere to be found. "Where is she?" I asked quickly, but there was no response. Eric looked just as confused as I was, and Hannah was staring at me as if she'd seen a ghost. I jumped to my feet and ran out of the shelter. The pale light of dawn was shining through the trees. Though the forest was quite dim, I could still see them. The eyes. Every tree in my line of sight had that same symbol carved into them, the one from the previous 2 nights. Every one of them was pointed directly at the shelter. The dim morning light played tricks on my vision, making the carvings look like shifting, disfigured faces. My voice caught in my throat. "See, Courtney." Eric was outside now too, shouting into the forest. Hannah was standing right next to me, looking frozen in fear. "You don't think," I managed to say to her, that she... "No." Hannah grabbed my arm reassuringly. "Aaron, no, she'll be fine, okay? We'll find her. We just have to..." "Ah!" yelled Eric suddenly. "What the fuck?" He had stopped shouting for Courtney and was now struggling with something at the edge of the woods. "Eric?" Hannah said, letting go of my arm to approach him. "Eric, what's wrong?" I approached too, only to see that Eric's foot was stuck under a tree root. "I must have walked right into it," he said, grimacing. He tried to free himself but couldn't move. "Wait up. I've got you." I knelt down and tried to pull his foot out myself. Then I tried to lift him up around the waist to get him out. Nothing seemed to work. "What the hell is this?" he said, panic in his voice now. The morning was getting brighter. The rain clouds that had been overhead for the past 24 hours seemed to be taking a break. As golden rays of light shone on the ground, I saw something so unbelievable that I almost fell over in shock. The tree root, which was already wrapped tightly around Eric's foot, was now tightening its grip even more. Thin wooden fingers were slowly sprouting out of the mud and wrapping around his ankle, coiling tightly. Hannah let out a loud scream. Shaking, I tried again to lift him up around the waist, but nothing was working. What was worse, he now seemed to be sinking. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What's happening?" "I don't know. It's..." I had him wrapped around the torso, pushing against the ground with all my strength. "It'll be fine." "Get him out of there," Hannah yelled, terrified. "Aaron, please get him out of the..." Crack. "Ah!" Eric let out a terrible scream, and I looked down to see that his lower leg was now bent at a harsh angle. His shin had snapped completely in half, and his foot was sticking out of the mud next to him. It was twisting in on itself, attached to the rest of his body by nothing but splintered bones and loose, tangled skin. He was shouting in pain, "Fuck! Help me!" But the tips of the roots that had circled his leg were now slithering towards me, and instinct took over. I fell backward into the mud and crawled away as quickly as I could, barely escaping the root ends nipping at my ankles. By the time I stood back up, Eric was almost waist deep in the earth. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." Crack. The part of Eric's body that was still visible tilted suddenly to one side. He was sinking slowly into the ground at an angle, the roots of the tree now wrapping around his core. He was looking at us in pure fear, but no longer seemed to have the voice to yell. Hannah was crying hysterically, making small motions to get closer, and then backing away again. I was jumping left and right, trying to find any way to approach. Eric's arm was reaching out to me in a last-ditch effort to be saved, but it was no use. There was no safe ground. Most of Eric's body was now completely hidden from view. The roots were tightening and tightening until... Crack! Eric's arm dropped suddenly to the ground, and his upper body hung limp and lifeless to one side. There was nothing to be done. Hannah fell to her knees, sobbing wildly, oblivious to the thin fingers sprouting out of the mud next to her. I ran over and managed to drag her away just in time, pulling her back towards the shelter and away from the trees. Though I covered her eyes to make sure she couldn't watch, I saw it. Eric's head sinking slowly into the earth, the whites of his eyes looking right at us. We fell to the shelter floor and huddled together in fear as the forest was filled once more with a series of unnerving clicks. Hannah and I stayed in that shelter for the next 6 days, shivering and crying in each other's arms as the rain pounded against the roof. Every once in a while, there were screams off in the distance, followed by that terrible rattling noise, but we never looked. We barely moved, only getting up to use the restroom or to open a can of cold vegetables. By the second day, we could hear helicopters flying above us. The authorities must have been alerted about the disappearances, but no one ever came to the shelter, and eventually we couldn't hear the helicopters anymore. The rain stopped on the 7th day. Once I was sure the ground was firm enough, I convinced Hannah that it was safe to leave. When we stepped outside, I noticed that the scenery had changed. The trees with the eyes carved into them were much closer to the shelter than before, but they now seemed to be solid as stone. We walked past them, eventually found a steep hill, and climbed it to find the cabins that Eric had mentioned. That was 26 years ago. Hannah and I have been together ever since, and now we have 2 wonderful children. I guess when you go through something so traumatic together, it's impossible for anyone else to understand you the same way they do. I've always hesitated to share this story because I feared no one would believe me, but I have no choice now. The weather channels are forecasting heavy rain in that area for the first time since 1998, and I don't want what happened to us to happen to anyone else. So please, before you go to Ojote National Park, remember this story. Think about what could happen to your loved ones, and think about that terrible clicking noise. Think about the rattle of the rain.